Welcome to Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Jude Russo and Joseph Addington. We're going to be talking about the Charlie Kirk assassination again this week. Unlike last week, we actually have more clarity on what happened and who the killer is. It appears to be Tyler Robinson. The assassination appears to have been motivated by his pro-trans feelings. It seems like he had a romantic partner who was trans, who he also lived with, and that this was sort of, in his mind, defense of his trans partner, killing Charlie Kirk, who had spoken out against some LGBT causes and activism. So we'll talk about that. We'll probably also get into Israel-related stuff. Marco Rubio was in Israel this week. The timing of his visit was rather awkward since last week Israel had done a air attack in Qatar, targeting Hamas negotiators who were there discussing a U.S. proposed Gaza ceasefire agreement. And we'll probably also get into Latin America stuff, especially Venezuela, with updates from Joseph Addington, our Latin America specialist. And actually, Joseph, I want to go to you first, returning to the topic of Charlie Kirk's assassination, because this week you wrote an article in the American Conservative arguing that the Trump administration indeed should crack down on left wing networks, left wing activism in response to the killing. That's the very thing that a lot of liberals are concerned about right now, that the Trump administration will use this murder as a pretext to go after their political enemies. Stephen Miller went on the Charlie Kirk podcast. You know, J.D. Vance, the vice president, stood in for Charlie Kirk and kind of guest hosted an episode of that podcast. Stephen Miller, the top Trump advisor, was one of the guests, and he gave every indication of intending to crack down on left wing agitators and people who he thought were involved, perhaps in a diffuse way. I couldn't really tell in this assassination. I think he even used the word terrorists to describe them. So, Joseph, can you talk about that issue a little bit and why you think the Trump administration indeed should crack down on the left?
Sure. I think, one of the things that we are seeing in modern American society is we are seeing an upsurge in generalized political violence. Um, and I think that there's a real concern that this could, metastasize into something a lot broader. And so I think one of the major things that for the good of everyone in the country needs to happen is to make sure that political violence is not seen as a profitable endeavor. That is, it cannot be any political assassination must result in crushing defeat for whatever cause attempted to perpetrate this kind of violence. Um, and I think that this is particularly a problem on the left because the left has a long history of essentially propping up, supporting, apologizing for, and enabling political violence. Um, there has been political violence on the right, but it's almost never of the same kind, and it's certainly not institutionally enabled in anywhere near the same fashion that the left is. Uh, in my article, I talked about, the especially the influence that the political terrorists of the 1960s and 1970s, the communist and left wing radicals had during that time period. Um, they were in many cases, prosecuted. Some of them did go to jail and so forth. But they were largely rehabilitated and institutionally supported, especially in the 80s, where they were offered often prestigious positions within the academic community and, in general, the sort of mainstream liberal intelligentsia, which was more than happy to accept them and allowed them in many ways to shape the current left wing milieu, which has been extremely, uh, very much influenced by the academic left wing that was in many ways a creation of the left wing radicals of the 60s and 70s. Barack Obama was taught by Bill Ayers, Weather Underground terrorist, right, at University of Chicago. This is not an obscure or minor detail. Um, and so one of the really important things that can be done is not specifically not. I want to point out this is not a, we should use the federal government to prosecute people for hate speech or for, saying things that we dislike about Charlie Kirk. That is not at all profitable. Pam Bondi was far out of line when she said that. What should be done is we should attack the institutional and especially the funding mechanisms that promote and enable left both political violence in general and public disorder. So the big name, of course, here is George Soros and his defense attorneys. But there are lots of these kinds of organizations, uh, you know, that range from Antifa style sort of uh, radical quasi militia movements to to more respectable mainstream academia. But in any case, the Supreme Court has ruled, and it's been good precedent for a long time, that the federal government has power to strip institutions of their tax exempt status if they are not in accordance with established public policy. And I think everyone can say that promoting political violence and apologizing for assassinations or promoting public disorder are not in accordance with public policy in the United States. It is very bad for the American federal government, for the American people, when left wing prosecutors and law enforcement refuse to prosecute career criminals and allow them to be on the streets and to murder and assault innocent people, like you saw with Irina Zarutska, right? Um, and so making sure that political assassination is always a negative sum game, making sure that political violence is a negative sum game, I think is very important. Um, just because if this is not a sustainable sort of equilibrium. You can't allow political violence to break out and have it predominate on one side. Eventually, it expands and it becomes a general. Eventually, you see both sides in pushed into a spiral of radicalization, and you get something much more dangerous and destructive, like the years of lead in Italy.
Jude, what are your thoughts in response to Joseph?
Well, I want to be careful to distinguish a few different points. Um, I think that obviously groups that commit and plan crimes should be prosecuted. Sort of a no-brainer. Um, but when we talk about targeted uh, crackdowns on particular ideological groups, I think that you have to be careful. I because I'm not dripping amniotic fluid all over my keyboard, and my memory goes back longer than 2 issues of The Economist. I remember the Obama administration's IRS targeting scandal, where uh, basically undue auditing pressure was pointed at conservative groups,
Tea Party
um,
groups.
particularly Tea Party groups, right? And we all sort of decided this was bad. The administration admitted it was doing it. Um, my concern is that uh, is pragmatic rather than principled. The right and the left are not equally matched partners in American politics. They are not just sort of the red and blue versions of some underlying material, right? It is actually an asymmetric game. The Democrats and the left have various institutional capacities and powers that the right do not have. The right is always going to be at a disadvantage in using the administrative state to pursue policy goals and to deliver bonks to its enemies. Um, and so I'm especially as it looks as if the administration, the way that it's talking about this stuff, is thinking of itself as just the red version of the other team. They're talking, Pam Bondi's on the TV saying baffling things about hate speech. They're talking about functionally doing the IRS targeting thing again. I think that this is sort of a mug's game. I think that the administrative state will always stymie conservative efforts to use it that way. And in the process, the permission structure will be created for the left to go over conservative groups this way. As I said, this is not a principled matter. This is a pragmatic matter. Yeah, Joseph.
Oh, I was going to say, I understand where you're coming from, but I think that there is an equally good pragmatic point that I would push back on, because I agree that this asymmetry exists. But at the same time, I would say that this actually makes the potential backlash, or the potential practical consequences uh favorable to us. First of all, peop I think the people should realize that sort of like the institutional structure on the left is much bigger. And so while the administrative state does tend to be more effective at targeting for the left, it means that there's a much more rich environment for the right to target. The institutions that the right can target are much more important, and there are much more of them. And so it's even if any particular attack on any particular institution is less likely to be effective. Um, we can target institutions that are much more that are important to the left's political ecosystem in ways that there are no corresponding targets for the right. And as far as the permission structure, I mean, it's sort of the same thing with canceling. The Obama administration already did that to conservatives. It's not a question of, well, what if they do it to us in the future? They've already done it to us in the past and admitted it. So there's no reason to think that if we do it now, they will do it in the future. They've already done it to us in the past, and if they want to do it to us in the future, then they can.
Well, yes, but the argument then is if it's a game where you are inherently disadvantaged, you rewrite the rules, right? Uh, Obama did it, but then he was punished by congressional oversight. It was a huge circus that, I know that you're still watching Power Rangers or whatever, but this sucked up 18 months of his administration. People resigned over it. It seems that instead of saying, well, yes, we are just going to try to do the Obama administrative state targeting thing again, and we're never going to be as good as at it as the other guys, but what's the rental car company? We're Avon. We're happy to be number two. Makes us work harder. No, what you should do is you should use the actual structural advantages available to the right. For example, our natural advantage in the legislature, particularly the upper chamber, and say, well, what if we actually put more oversight checks from Congress onto federal law enforcement? What if, for once, instead of just giving away power to the executive, the part of the government where we actually do, in fact, have a structural advantage, what if it sticks up for itself for once and actually fights to take some power back? Which, would
That
be
would be
subject to
nice,
court
but I
challenges and
can't
all kinds
see
of stuff.
Congress ever doing anything,
I
honestly.
know, but I mean, at the end of the day, and I've made that argument myself, but I do not, whenever you're doing political deliberation, you have to accept as a premise that we must do something. And if we have already accepted as a premise that we are going to do something, I would prefer to argue that people do the thing that will actually work instead of the thing that's going to blow up in our faces hilariously. And not just as a matter of, this technique is going to get uglier and be used against us in ways that it frankly has not been for about 10 years because there was a political punishment for it. It's also going to further weaken the rights coalition. I mean, just about everybody on Twitter who wasn't named Benny Johnson vomited in his shoes when he saw Pam Bondi's comments on Fox. This was not popular with the right.
She
This is it.
said that the hate speech crackdown that she was imagining would target both sides of the political aisle. So, like, in
Great.
response to Charlie
Cool.
Kirk's assassination, we're going to go after so called anti Semitism among right wingers. Like, that seemed to be the implication.
Well, I'm gonna tread carefully there. The I think that it is symptomatic of this administration that they think they are much more popular than they are. They think that they have a much firmer command of the coalition than they do.
I think they're much more clever than they are as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's also the fact that they're frankly incompetent in many respects.
Our FBI director spells his first name with a dollar sign. I mean,
So do I, and there isn't even an S in my first name. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I actually think that Kash Patel, my sense is that he's gotten kind of a raw deal here because while he committed a number of PR blunders, um, he's not going to, put on his little houndstooth Sherlock Holmes cap and like run out there and start looking for clues. Like his job is basically administrative and personnel oriented. Um, you know, what do you expect him to do? Like, presumably, the people, with the sniffy dogs and like the computer stuff, the people who actually make the work of law enforcement happening, were doing their thing. I don't feel, I recognize that bad PR and bad politics are, to some degree real, but also, like, who cares? Who cares? What else was he supposed to do?
well, I could get into that, but I kind of want to keep us on topic because Joseph, I'm wondering, in response to your argument that that the Trump administration, I suppose, including the FBI, should crack down on the left. I would encourage people to go read this Ken Klippenstein. Is it Klippenstein or Klippenstein? Can't remember. He's kind of a lefty journalist, independent journalist. He got sent to him some Discord chats between Tyler Robinson, the suspect, seems like definitely the assassin, and his kind of group, his online group that he played video games with. Discord is the social platform and messaging app.
It's
Clearly,
it's Slack for Democrats.
it's well, right wingers have been known to use it, and apolitical people have been known to use it. It's kind of Slack
For
with
what it's worth,
strangers,
I use Discord and all my friends use Discord. It's not
right?
a
That's
particularly
going in the dossier.
politically valent system.
That. Sorry, I gotta put that in the HR dossier.
Well, what's interesting about this is, obviously Tyler Robinson wasn't apolitical. Like he was motivated by a kind of pro-trans ideology. And so people who originally assumed that the shooter was a lefty, the assumption was based on the fact that Charlie Kirk, a conservative, was killed. They ended up being right. At the same time, his political ideology doesn't seem very coherent or deeply rooted, and it seems like the the group that he was interacting with on Discord, and again, Discord has been framed as this like left-wing terrorism app or something by the like very old people who govern us. But it seems like they genuinely were surprised that he did this. They didn't understand. He didn't talk about politics much. He mentioned Biden and Trump each respectively only one time in the like years that they had been interacting with him, according to the search that Klippenstein did on the chats. And so my question, and Jude, it seems like you have something to say, but to Joseph, it seems to me that it's plausible that Tyler Robinson genuinely was a kind of lone wolf. And he was motivated by left wing ideology, seemingly. But I'm not sure what groups you could even implicate in this assassination beyond Robinson himself.
And this is, if I can just butt in for a moment, um, uh, someday, right wingers will actually like go out there and read a book and understand that we are not talking about uh, the common turn here. We are not talking about organizations on the left. There are complexes of NGOs, which are often adjacent, but we're mostly talking about scenes, right? Antifa is not an organization where you can attack a funding structure or find, the org chart when you raid their office building. It's a scene. Uh, we're talking about, like, I, I don't know, raiding. We're talking about the equivalent here of cracking down on Greenwich Village in the early 70s. Like, it's not an organization. It is a bunch of people who are associated. There are actual organizational structures which they are perhaps affiliated with in this way or another. But the way that the right tends to talk about left wing radicalism, it's clear that they still haven't really gotten over the Cold War. And it is actually difficult to uh, go after left wing radicalism if what you were expecting is everybody to have a little red card in their pocket.
Yeah, that I think that adds to my question, Joseph. How would you respond to both those? That this left wing organizational structure is very diffuse, and then my point that based on his Discord chats, it doesn't seem like he was even involved in a so-called left wing scene. He was motivated. He had a left wing ideology, it seems, but I don't know if he had any friends or accomplices who shared his perspective, and none, it seems, that wanted him to kill Charlie Kirk.
Well, we'll see. I personally am still of the opinion that more will come out. I'm very skeptical of this idea that he was apolitical. I suspect that there's more that we don't know about. Um,
I'm not saying he was apolitical. He was motivated by a left wing ideological view,
oh
but he
no, no,
wasn't
no. I just
organized.
mean I'm just referring to the sort of the Klippenstein contention that because he didn't bring up partisan politics, that this was some kind of, momentary aberration, and that otherwise he didn't care about politics all that much. I've seen that going around, and I think that is a complete misread of the situation. But you are completely correct, and Jude is completely correct, that this is not sort of
You can take
an
that to the bank.
organized conspiracy. There is no, like, large network. There are no secret communists pulling all of the strings. It is in accordance with the way that social media and the internet works, an extremely fragmented situation where usually what happens is, and this is why I suspect more will come out, is because usually the way that these things work is there is a large overlap. One person is in a lot of different Discord servers and on a lot of different subreddits and on Blue Sky and this is on the left. There's the exact same thing that happens on the right. Lots of these overlapping chat rooms with friends that overlap in different ways between all of these different kinds of social media groupings and so forth. And radicalization, when it happens, generally happens sort of as an accretion of ideas that have been picked up in different ways from different people over long periods of time. And so the way that you have to go about the way that you have to go about treating these things is to look at it as sort of I'm not attempting to undermine any particular kind of political organization. What I'm attempting to do is essentially increase the cost of the cost of the transaction cost for these people to essentially live and conduct themselves in the way that they do. And one of the ways that you do this is by removing the organizations that support them, that provide propaganda and political and academic sinecures, because generally these people are like not productive citizens. They live a lot of times off of political activism and academic sinecures and political sinecures through these various organizations. Um, and so, though that's the way that you have to think about it, is increasing the transaction costs and making it more difficult for this kind of politics to be sort of a viable way of living. This is the way that Milei conceptualizes his political project in Argentina.
Well, Mouvet has the benefit of actually working with with real institutional structures that he can fight. I'm sorry, there's no way to what you're describing. It may be politically expedient to conflate left wing professors with kids passing around crummy memes on Reddit or Discord, but they're not the same at all. In fact, a lot of the content and ideology at this point is disseminated from the ground up. either openly on social media or through samizdat on mailing lists or whatever. Um, I'd also point out that the influence of left wing professors, if the best thing that they can do is produce Barack Obama, who governed as a center right president, uh, I'm actually not super worried. I think that, as I said, it may be politically expedient to uh, conflate Antifa rioters, regularly attacking federal law enforcement buildings in Portland, as apparently they still are 5 years later. Nobody reports on it. Um, it may be nice to conflate that with Bill Ayers or, Martha Nussbaum or like whatever your lefty theorist of choice is. But I think that uh, as far as actual radical action goes, the latter is not important. Um, I also think that it's worth underlining that being a political radical is not itself a crime. You are allowed to have all kinds of crummy ideas. Doing crimes is the problem. And, it could be that once we, flood the zone looking for radical trans terrorists or whatever, the way that the FBI under Biden looked for white supremacists, maybe we will find that there are actually quite a lot of people who are planning and participating in riots and doing this kind of stuff. But we do, I'm skeptical. I think that mostly what you see in these spaces is people talking very big talk, uh, but you have very, very few actual actions, right? We are not, in fact, anywhere near the years of lead. It's actually still pretty safe to be a public figure in America. Safer in America than it is in many notionally peaceful second world countries. I think that uh, there's actually a very high cost to do terrorism. I think that most people just are not interested in it. They want to post crappy memes. And unfortunately, by some people's lights, that's not against the law. And I'm not really interested in spinning up the surveillance state further because when we inevitably lose the White House in 28 or 32 or 36, we're just going to leave them with the keys to a very large, powerful car pointed in a very unpleasant direction.
Yeah, I think that's right. Joseph, I'm going to give you a chance to do kind of a brief riposte before we move to a different topic. But I wanted to add, I agree with this point that Jude makes that this is a very bottom up problem. And I'll just point out that, the problem seems to be that a lot of people on the left and a lot of young people, especially, are very emotionally and morally attached to the whole like metaphysics of the whole trans thing, right? Like I remember when I was in Asheville, North Carolina, admittedly a very progressive lefty place. I like to work in coffee shops rather than at home when I'm writing and editing. And on this occasion, I went to one coffee shop, and my
It's going
barista
into
had
HR dossier also.
the barista had a "Protect Trans Kids" shirt with a like knife. You've seen it. You've seen the shirt. And I went into the restroom, and there was this, graffiti on the wall that said, "Trans women are real women," or something like that. And I got my espresso, and like I was just, it wasn't because of that necessarily, but I was just like not feeling this coffee shop, and so I went into a different one, and my barista the barista at this new shop had the exact same shirt. Like this is something that really has kind of infiltrated culture and like become just part of the like ambient experience of living in America, especially in a blue city. Charlie Kirk was trying to address that issue by speaking, very forthrightly about the trans thing, giving his conservative view on it and inviting college students, especially, to disagree with him. Obviously, he seems to have been shot for that reason. Like he was answering a question about trans violence and whether trans people are disproportionately likely to be mass shooters. He wasn't killed by a trans person, but he was killed by someone who was acting on behalf of the pro trans cause, seemingly. So I think that this, the desire to clamp down on left-wing organizations, it's almost wishful thinking because it's like this isn't related to organizations. This is related to like ideology that I think is
and technology.
right,
Like,
ideology and technology, and ideology that I think is more passionate at the ground level than among like professors at elite universities. Um, well, what do you think about that, Joseph? Just to kind of round us out or take us home here.
Sure, my argument would be that this is, you know, very much a product of left-wing institutional dominance. Sure, the people on the ground are not picking it up directly from left-wing university professors, but the it was the massive intellectual output, the large effect, the cultural dominance that is produced by left-wing institutional dominance. This happens, of course, in the universities, uh, especially, and so the universities tend more than anything to set the tenor of sort of the acceptable elite ideals to which much of society conforms. You also see it in entertainment and media. That's an entirely different problem. But I think that the I think that a lot of the ambient, what people take as just sort of the natural American culture is the result of essentially, a left-wing march through the institutions that took place in the 80s, and the product of which is the culture that we see now, which we might take to be organically, sort of from the left, and that may be true in part, especially due to some changes in, in technology, especially. Um, but I think a lot of it is due to institutional dominance, and that if in some counterfactual world, the right had taken very seriously universities and those kinds of formative elite institutions, and had not, in effect, surrendered them to left wing institutional dominance, you would not see a lot of the same cultural effects that you see today. And so, if we want to reverse that, and it will take, I would say that it would take a significant amount of time, and there's no guarantee that such a project will be successful. Um, but I would say that if you want to start to reverse that, then you do have to take seriously the question of institutional dominance. So that would be my response.
Okay, I think we need to move on to a different topic. Let's at least briefly discuss Israel. I'm writing this week about Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State and National Security Advisor's trip to Israel. It came at an awkward time. As I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, last week, Israel launched an airstrike in Qatar, targeting Hamas negotiators who had gathered to discuss a peace proposal offered by the Trump administration. It seems like they didn't actually kill the targeted Hamas negotiators, although I do think they
it
killed some
scared the hell out
Hamas
of them, though.
members. Yeah, it drove them underground, and it made Qatar very reluctant to, continue in its role as a mediator between Hamas and Israel.
Remind me if the U.S. government ever invites me in to negotiate for anything, not to do it.
Right. I mean, there is suspicions among many people that the Trump administration has twice now kind of participated in some sort of strange deception campaign whereby the U.S. is ostensibly leading peace negotiations and getting negotiators to kind of consider U.S. proposals so that Israel can more easily kill them. This happened in June with the 12-day war that Israel launched, taking out a lot of political and military people, but including Iran's main negotiator. He actually ended up surviving that attack. Everyone thought he was dead initially. And now it's seemingly happened again. The Trump administration initially had denied foreknowledge of the attack. I think they had a somewhat ambiguous statement, but it seemed to be saying that the missiles were already flying by the time Israel had notified them. Interestingly, during Marco Rubio's trip, and I think this was basically a humiliation tour for Marco Rubio, on Monday, he arrived Sunday, he left Tuesday, and on Monday, Axios released this big report citing at least three anonymous Israeli officials saying that the Israeli government, in fact, had pre notified Trump before striking Qatar, basically saying the White House was lying. When Rubio arrived, Israel was escalating its bombing of Gaza City and its demolition of residential buildings there. By the time he left, they had started, like, as he was leaving, approaching his plane, they began the ground offensive in Gaza City. I think 350,000 people have already fled Gaza City throughout the war, but there's still about 500,000 people remaining. It's like a major urban hub on the Strip. Um, so, negotiations aren't happening because Israel tried to kill the Hamas negotiators. It seems like this war is just going to continue until Israel achieves what it considers to be total military victory. Rubio, even though the U.S. ostensibly, supposedly wants a diplomatic resolution, he went along with Netanyahu's comments. Rubio basically said that Israel needs to defeat Hamas, and that until that happens, negotiations aren't on the table. Um, so, people who had been hoping for a ceasefire, for them, this was like a splash of cold water. I think it was kind of embarrassing to see Rubio do this. Qatar, we should say, is a U.S. ally. And for those who, a lot of people reacted to this news last week of Israel killing these Hamas people and saying, oh, well, Hamas, they're terrorists. Of course, Israel could kill them. But you need to understand some things. One, these were the political faction, the negotiators, as I mentioned. Two, as I mentioned, they were considering a U.S. proposed peace deal. And three, Israel has been facilitating Qatar's funding of Hamas for like years. Like that was part of Netanyahu's strategy to keep the Palestinian people politically divided between the West Bank and Gaza. So that was a totally cynical move. And now I'm sure Qatar is pissed off that they were bombed and they're accused of like harboring terrorists, given this history. Um, so people can go read my article. It'll publish tomorrow. Jude, my first question to you is: did my title of my article, did it survive your editing? Little Marco buys time for Greater Israel.
It sure did, and you benefited from the fact that I wrote something far cattier and meaner about Marco Rubio today. So I sort of felt like I had to let it ride. Avoid which charges of hypocrisy I can. Um, but I think that as far as whether or not the Trump administration greenlit this operation, um, I am inclined to think not, because for two reasons. First off, the administration sort of scrambled and acted real embarrassed after this happened in a way that would be an unusually impressive and well executed deception for this administration. If we're being quite honest, they don't tend to have a ton of subtlety when it comes to messaging. Um, the story that they gave us and that the Qataris confirmed was that we got the call and then Witkoff called the Qataris, and they picked up the phone from Witkoff as the first missiles were hitting. Like they could hear the booming over the phone line on this call. I think that also lines up with what happened with the Iran negotiations, which was very clearly, we put out afterwards this story. Oh, it was this big, deception. This, so we could ambush them. That was clearly CYA. In my opinion. Second reason that I think that makes sense is that the Israelis do have an incentive to say that the Americans greenlit this stuff because it damages the United States' credibility as a good faith negotiator. Israel does not want the United States, or at least Israel's current government, I should say, does not want the United States negotiating with these regional rivals to Israel. They would prefer the United States be in perpetual low-level warm to hot conflict with these guys. So if they do things that discredit American negotiation will go that much less far, that much shorter, and it will encourage the United States to continue having a hard power involvement in the area. So irrespective of what actually happened, the Israelis don't want anybody negotiating with the United States, and are encouraged to put out, by their anonymous sources with Barak Ravid, whatever messaging it requires to get that done. We saw a certain amount of this with the Iran stuff, where there were lots and lots of leaks coming from anonymous Israeli sources alleging various levels of American involvement. Many of them proved to be, if not outright lies, at least inaccurate in important ways.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add to provide some more context for the Rubio meeting, and I think I agree with you, Jude. I'm skeptical that Trump, like, certainly that he orchestrated this attack somehow, or that he was involved in the planning stages with Israel. I think the White House is probably telling the truth that they didn't get sufficient notification of these strikes because Trump really likes these Gulf states, and he wants the U.S. to have good relations with him. And I did get the sense of some genuine frustration on the administration's part with these Israeli strikes. And that's kind of similarly, actually, to how I feel about the Israeli strikes on Iran in June. Just to give more context for Rubio's trip, the UN on Friday, the General Assembly overwhelmingly voted in favor of a resolution, supporting a two-state solution for Israel-Palestine. And then on Tuesday, I believe, the last day of Rubio's trip, a UN commission, which comprises some like serious scholars of genocide, ruled for the first time that Israel is committing a genocide against the Palestinians. Previously that commission had stopped short of that, saying that they were guilty of war crimes and stuff like that. But now they put the actual, genocide charge out there and found it to be right. So I don't think that's going to affect Israel's behavior, but there's been a theme in recent months of this sharply escalating diplomatic pressure against Israel. I think next week is when these European countries, led by France, are expected to recognize the state of Palestine. Most states already have done so, and certainly states reflecting the majority of the global population. Um, and last week, another theme is America is becoming isolated as a supporter of Israel. I think on Friday, when there was this UN resolution, the U.S. could only get 9 other countries to join its vote against that resolution. One of them was Israel itself. At least one of them I had never heard of before. It has a population of 12,000. What's it called? Nauru.
Nauru,
Nauru.
yes. There is
If I
a really good article in a rival publication last month, Harper's, about Zionism among the Pacific Islanders. Weird stuff. You should go read it. Harper's puts out a good product.
And I had assumed that the U.S. just kind of strong-armed whatever tiny nations it could, but maybe there was some organic pro-Israel sentiment there. And if I had
There's
heard of that country, I had
yeah,
forgotten it.
apparently some significant number of Pacific Islanders claim to be the lost tribes, and there's like the evangelical eschatological stuff all mixed in with it. So
Yeah. So yeah, we'll keep our eye on this mounting diplomatic pressure and America and what's going to happen next week with France and these other countries. Joseph, let's go ahead and get updates from you on Latin America. I understand the U.S. took out another Venezuelan boat. Is our military footprint continuing to increase in the Caribbean? Are we about to go to war? What's going on?
Okay. Yeah, so there was another strike on a drug boat, killed 3 people. Um, Details are scarce. We have a video that the military has put out, shows about the exact same thing as the other video. Um, Not a lot of details to go on, as there tend to be in these cases. The U.S. military continues to trickle additional air assets into Puerto Rico, F-35s. Um, but there certainly doesn't appear to be any prospect of an invasion of Venezuela or anything like that. If there are any military interventions in Venezuela, you could see something like a Tomahawk cruise missile strike, I suppose, on uh if I were going to say that there were going to be a military intervention in Venezuela, I would guess that it would be the U.S. launches a Tomahawk cruise missile strike on some site in Venezuela that the federal government comes out and says this was like a training camp for Tren de Aragua or some other kind of cartel asset that the U.S. military is taking out on Venezuelan territory. That would be my guess. There is not any real prospect, I think, of boots on the ground in Venezuela. The invasion of Panama in 89 required tens of thousands of American troops, and Panama is a much smaller and much easier country to invade than Venezuela. If we were going to invade Venezuela or do any kind of meaningful, like, real military occupation, heaven forbid, you would know. There would not be a way to hide something like that. So the question is whether we get into some kind of low-level military intervention like cruise missile or drone strikes, I think. That's the question. I would say it's possible. The administration's rhetoric has been extremely aggressive towards Venezuela. We saw Marco Rubio saying that essentially the Venezuelan government is illegitimate, and so the United States more or less has a blank check to do whatever they want with regard to the nation. Uh, in a sense, like, that's true, uh, insofar as, Maduro is obviously not a democratically elected leader. He blatantly stole the election and barely even pretended to have won the vote. So clearly he does not have the endorsement of the Venezuelan people. But also, he controls the government. Like, he is the leader of the state of Venezuela, and if we try to pretend that he's not, then we're just fooling ourselves. Uh, so,
So I have a question actually. You're saying that it's unlikely that we're going to do an actual military action, like when people think of a war. It's unlikely we're going to do that in Venezuela because of just the natural geographic difficulties. Um, and that maybe there's some sort of ongoing low level conflict similar to what we've had with it for various periods with Iran or any other given bad guy of the week. Um, has the administration actually articulated what it wants out of Venezuela?
no.
Okay,
Well,
because see
Donald Trump has said,
that's what my sort of
"Stop
concern
sending
is.
criminals and stop sending drugs." But
But they've
Venezuela,
basically
unlike
done
Colombia, is yeah.
right. Yeah, I mean, like, so the drugs thing, like, yes, some amount of it's facilitated through Venezuela, but Venezuela is not actually a drug superpower, and also by State Department assessments, Venezuela is actually pretty good for a Latin American country on drug enforcement, relatively cooperative with international structures to crack down on that sort of thing. Um, so
Maduro doesn't
that
want competing power centers. He doesn't
right,
want big
no, I mean,
cartels present.
right, exactly. Which the the administration seems to be betting, probably correctly, that most Americans think everything south of Texas is basically Mexico, and that Mexico's problems just sort of replicate in each country as you go down through Latin America. But that is not, in fact, true. Um, so I guess my concern is that if there is no actual explicit off ramp with Venezuela, we're going to stop doing this stuff if you guys stop doing something. I mean, Venezuelan immigration to the United States has fallen to basically zero since the new administration took power because people just aren't coming anymore. They know that the door is closed. If there's no actual explicit non-specious off ramp, what are we doing here?
Yeah, and to put a finer point on that, if the drug thing is a pretext, if the immigration thing is a pretext, what is the actual point of this, Joseph?
Well, that's a good question. I wish that I could mind read for you the Western Hemisphere policy of this
But you
administration.
know, usually you can assess the interests, the geopolitical interests of states and kind of discern what
We
their
should also, I
motivations
guess, put
are.
an asterisk and say that Marco Rubio's daddy problems about Latin American communists uh, is not necessarily the most
But
compelling
Trump
argument
did
either.
this in Trump did this in his first administration too, though. Not quite at this scale, but the same thing was happening, you know.
Well, my memory of that is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my memory of that is that in the first administration, Venezuela was playing a lot of footsie with China, and we have had a consistent, um, real and also well articulated interest in preventing China from hanging out in the Western Hemisphere doing stuff. Um, And so my memory, and as I said, correct me if I'm wrong, but my memory is that the much of the Venezuela stuff was in response to China stuff and also in response to energy markets stuff. Like there is one of the constant recombinations of the state oil company at that time.
Yeah, well, also one of the big things that happened, yeah, China was much more active in Venezuela in 2016, uh, or well, in during the first Trump presidency. Um, And then in 2019, you saw the election. You saw another disputed presidential election, and essentially the U.S. kind of bet that it could maybe force Maduro to recognize Juan Guaido as the president of Venezuela, which did not work out and was a disaster. Um, but yes, China no longer wants anything to do with Venezuela. Also, Russia was significantly more involved in Venezuela. Both countries have kind of learned that Venezuela is a disaster for literally everybody except for Maduro, and so now no longer wants anything to do with it. China has wasted probably over $100 billion in investments in Venezuela that they will see nothing from in return. So in a sense,
So what I'm hearing is that we want to keep Maduro in power.
in a sense, except China has learned, which is why they're not investing anything in Venezuela anymore. Maduro would love to get the Chinese to spend more money there, but they want nothing to do with it. But yes, that's the problem. There aren't many major concrete interests, and if I had to guess, it would be a sort of ideological orientation from Marco Rubio and elsewhere in the State Department that just sees Venezuela as an illegitimate government and wants to overturn it for ideological reasons.
My own pet theory about this is that the Pentagon, the US broadly, are reorienting, our pivot to Asia never happened, and instead we did a 180, and now we're coming all the way back to the Western Hemisphere. It's kind of a Monroe Doctrine 2.0, and I think that just taking out these Venezuelan drug boats, alleged drug boats, I'm extremely skeptical they were actually trafficking drugs, and doing this huge buildup of military power in the Caribbean. I think it's a way for the administration to inaugurate this new geopolitical paradigm, this new Monroe Doctrine. And so it's kind of symbolic in a way.
Yeah, which is just real depressing. Um,
Mhm.
but
Who
yeah,
knows? Perhaps they're clandestinely preparing Bay of Pigs too, and the real object is the overthrow of the Cuban government. That would be even nearer
That'd
and
be
dearer to
sneaky.
Mr.
that
Rubio's
seems like it
heart.
would be a much easier lift.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. The Cuban government cannot keep the lights on. It would probably collapse if we blew too hard on it.
Right. Well, and which means that since my aim is to become first American Governor General of Cuba, I'm probably going to have to revoke all the mean things I've said about the administration in the past month, if that is the case. But yeah, it seems like much, like both more justifiable because while Cuba does not send drugs to the United States, Cuba is actually still rather um strangely enough, Cuba still is a major espionage power. There are actually rather a lot of Cuban spies still in the United States. Um, and it's much closer to us. I think that there's more there than there is for Venezuela.
The U.S. has
Um,
always recognized a pretty large interest in Cuba, so
right.
for various
And
reasons.
we've always done a very poor job of securing it.
Oh
In
yeah,
part because we're trying to assassinate Castro with, self-detonating cigars for decades. Um, I think we need to move on to picks of the week. I'm gonna pick "The Severe Downsides of Transhumanism Paranoia" by Scott Greer, and he was reacting to the NatCon and the National Conservatism Conference, and how people were talking about transhumanism as the ideological bugaboo of conservatism, and he explains why that actually can orient conservatives toward policies that are bad for the MAGA movement, and they should not grope, desperately for some ideological enemy and arrive at transhumanism, which he doesn't think is actually the ideological enemy of MAGA conservatism. Jude, what's your pick of the week?
so I'm going with John Burns's 9/11 and the Real Realism, which was a piece that we ran on the anniversary of 9/11. Um, John is one of our friends over at Veterans for America. And it just is a reflection on his evolution um, in thinking about American foreign policy and the limits of American foreign policy and the unintended consequences of American foreign policy. Concerned Veterans for America obviously is a veterans group, um, and it takes a sort of um, larger view perspective on issues that touch American veterans than the traditional groups like American Legion do. So while they are concerned about VA reform, which is like the classic veterans group issue, they are also concerned about, the fact that we do all these stupid petty wars in dumb parts of the world and it chews up human beings and spits them out. Um, so it's a good piece. Uh I'm a bit younger than Mr. Burns, but it does reflect some of my own evolution ideologically. When 9/11 happened, everybody was on board with the program that was presented as the response to 9/11. There is this magazine, which opposed the Iraq invasion a couple years later, and there was Harper's. There was McSweeney's Quarterly. Those are the three publications that opposed the imperial policy proposed by the Bush era as the solution to what happened on 9/11. And I think that those of us who actually, paid attention, had eyes to see, saw that maybe this didn't go so well, and we changed what we thought based on reality. So 9/11 and the real realism, a dispatch from the reality-based community. The Karl Rove joke, Joseph. You weren't born yet, but, it was important back then.
Joseph, what's your pick of the week?
Sure, I'll take Spencer Neal's The Ghostly Brilliance of Banksy's Anti-War Masterpiece, talking about Banksy's art piece in the UK and the political situation over there. It's an interesting art piece and a good essay by Spencer, who always turns out quality work.
And that brings us to the end of today's episode. I want to thank our listeners on podcast apps for listening until the end and remind them that they can watch videos of these episodes on YouTube. I want to thank people who are watching on YouTube, remind them to smash the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment, let us know how great you found the episode. And I want to thank you, Jude, and you, Joseph, for the illuminating conversation. See you next time.